Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to conduct an analysis of the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. Now before we begin our analysis, I'd just like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on some of the larger points that we discussed in our discussion on civil rights. Uh, Firstly, I'd like to address the two major pieces of federal legislation that came out of the civil rights movement: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They are two seminal pieces of legislation that continue to affect our lives right down to the very present, outlawing racial discrimination in voting practices as well as in public accommodations. And also, we have to address the two titans, the two pillars of social philosophy and thought and political thought of the mid 20th century civil rights movement. That would be Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Having early on, they had diametrically opposed ideas in terms of following the separatist policy and the integrationist policy. Towards the end of their lives, they sort of coalesced into this sort of firm stance to press for greater opportunities for the African American community, while also embracing a multi-ethnic outlook for the future of American society. Um, and with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our analysis. And throughout the 1950s, though that time, that decade, had this aura of just abject prosperity and affluence, it really wasn't for the African American community. They were largely left out of the Republic prosperity. Now, the Brown decision, which ended legal segregation in public schools, was decided in 1964, and the culmination of this long period, this long struggle to end Jim Crow segregation in public schools that we spoke about at length during our lectures on the civil rights movement and during our discussion on Thurgood Marshall. The Brown decision was sort of the capstone event of that struggle. The legal phase of the civil rights movement was led by the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, and after World War II, the United States military forces were integrated. The government under President Harry Truman initiated this, and during the Korean War, for the first time ever, American forces were integrated. They were sent overseas integrated, and they were trained at home in integrated units. The election of 1948 was also a great watershed moment in American politics. It illustrated that a great shift had happened. The Democratic Party had divided on the question of civil rights. Mayor Hubert Humphrey of Minneapolis gave a passionate and rousing speech on behalf of civil rights, urging that the Democratic Party had to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk into the bright sunshine, the bright sunlight of human rights. In other words, he laid out a challenge to the other party members to remove the bastion from which segregation is hid. The party appears to split along sectional lines reminiscent to the split that had occurred in 1860, with the Dixiecrats walking out of the convention and creating an alternative political party and running Strom Thurmond of South Carolina as the Dixiecrat candidate. Now, the election of 1948 was the most surprising election of the 20th century, as the Democratic Party appeared to be irreparably split, as the Dixiecrats and segregationists from the southeastern states walked out, and the old Henry Wallace progressives walked out. Henry Wallace, if we remember, had been Franklin Roosevelt's vice president during his third term in office. He was not taking along Roosevelt on his re-election campaign in 1944 in favor of Harry Truman. Now, Wallace was seen as less antagonistic towards the Soviet Union than the rest of the Democratic Party leaders. Wallace thought that the Cold War was not necessary, that all this blustering and posturing and positioning was not necessary, and he wanted to cool tensions down. Now, Truman won in an astonishing election result. He defeated Tom Dewey. And it is really immortalized in this iconic photograph of a smiling Truman holding the Chicago Tribune's with the a copy of the Chicago Tribune with the infamous headline, "Dewey beats Truman." Now, Truman's victory showed that a pro-civil rights stance like Humphrey's was not politically destructive. Also, the previous year, Major League Baseball had been integrated by Jackie Robinson, a move that brought a number of African American players into the three major sports. Now, the Brown decision had immense consequences as it indicated that all public facilities were heading down the road towards desegregation. A major reversal of domestic policy that went back to the Redeemers, that went back to redemption, and it was firmly enforced by the Plessy decision. Now, the Supreme Court, under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, used sociological and psychological evidence to show that a separate education was for African Americans inherently unequal. The court found that even if the schools had been equal, the fact that they were separate was harmful. Now, President Eisenhower had appointed Earl Warren to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he did so because he thought Warren was a safe bet. He was a safe appointment. Warren had been the man who had overseen the internment of the Japanese during the wartime hysteria in California. And while he was he did that while he was acting as the Attorney General of California. Now, for us, Earl Warren has a peculiar legacy. On the one hand, he committed one of the worst civil rights violations, one of the worst atrocities in overseeing the internment of the Japanese. And on the other hand, he played an important role, a significant role, in removing the legal protections of Jim Crow segregation. In a series of cases before the Brown cases, known as the graduate cases that we discussed in our lecture on Thurgood Marshall, those cases are known as the graduate cases. The court simply undid the legal protection granted to segregationist states, and really sort of doubled down on the legal principle that separate schools really need to be equal. It was sort of a double-edged blade in that they did not outright outlaw separate schools, separate institutions. They simply laid the challenge before the segregationist states to either make the schools all equal or simply have one school. Now the result was that at the time of the Brown case, the segregationists went out and they began to busy themselves by building and improving schools for African Americans. Now, the following year, in a decision known as Brown 2, the Supreme Court ruled that the school segregation, that school desegregation should be done with all deliberate speed, which really became an ambiguous phrase. It was interpreted by pro-segregationists as a measure that would allow them to delay and take their time integrating and improving schools. The Dixiecrats went on to formulate a plan of massive resistance to prevent ethnic integration. On the heels of the legal phase of the on the heels of the legal phase of the civil rights movement came the activist phase. Right after the Brown decision, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African American boy, was murdered in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman while at a convenience store. Now, Till's murder sent a shock through the African American community that sparked the activist phase of the civil rights movement. Beginning with Rosa Parks' arrest and the formation of the Montgomery Improvement Association, African Americans began to agitate for equality on a scale unbefore seen in the Republic. Now, Martin Luther King, who rose to fame by leading the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted a full year, took this opportunity, took the success of the boycotts to push for the complete desegregation of all public transportation in the city of Montgomery. King and the other leaders used local community churches to reinforce community solidarity and arranging for alternate means of travel for members who had long distance commutes. After the Montgomery bus boycott, King went on to write a book entitled Strive Towards Freedom, in which he speculates on why Montgomery was the right site for the first major protest victory. Vacillating between the integrated Air Force Base, the strength of the local NAACP, and himself being a chief and deciding factor, King ultimately decided that it was all these things plus God being on their side, which has an historian really sort of puts you in this awkward situation where it's like you can believe in religion and all that, and you can believe that your God has a plan for you, but at the same time you want to look at the facts on the ground and sort of weigh social strengths and the social options that sort of led to a particular outcome. Now, in the following years, civil rights groups mounted campaigns wherever they thought they would be able to get a confrontation with segregationists, and they did so to attract television and newspaper reporters so that they would cover the events. They understood quite well that they could use the media to spread awareness to help their cause. Sit-ins at lunch counters at places, particularly the regional sit-in, the sit-in at the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, attracted widespread media coverage. It became sort of a frenzy, and they really helped spur the desegregation of stores. The freedom rides to desegregate interstate travel both provoked aggression, and they both all of the freedom rides. I wasn't get to those. There were multiple, but they all attracted media coverage. As it sort of became a frenzy to see the latest news, to see the latest bit of aggression coming out of the Southeast. Now, the organizers always made sure to alert the journalists ahead of time so that they could witness the violence firsthand. Now, these civil rights organizations also designed courses to prepare the members not to react to the violence and to the racially charged atmosphere. Now, the temptation when attacked, as we all know, is to defend yourself. And the method of nonviolence, which was borrowed from Mohandas Gandhi and the Indian independence movement, really called for almost superhuman restraint in such conditions. Gandhi himself realized that he could use the British guilty conscience to his advantage. That non-violence was a very effective weapon if the opponent had a conscience. Now, King was also a very artful orator, and in all of his speeches, he drew on this Christian rhetoric and made heavy uses of biblical quotes. Religion was the greatest link between the communities in segregated America, and he brought about a lot of reconciliation through the shared Christian beliefs. Now, nonviolence also allowed the activists to maintain the moral high ground because they did not retaliate. It wasn't an instance of, well, this is simply two sides, two different ethnicities fighting each other out. This was one group who very peacefully tried to bring about social change, and another group who used brutal repression, much the same way that we would sort of view Stalin and other communist leaders using brutal repression to keep subjugated peoples in line. It was really a mirror image when you look at it, and that was exactly how they wanted it to be portrayed. Now, the city of Atlanta had perhaps the best experience with integration. Under Mayor William Hartsfield, the city's leaders worked out a desegregation plan. Now, Hatfield was not a hardline segregationist. He had been happy before with segregation, and he was happy now to see it dismantled. Atlanta emerged from the entire affair with a new city branding campaign, calling itself the city too busy to hate. And taking a page out of King's book, the city invited journalists to the city on the day the public schools were desegregated. And they really pulled off a remarkable public relations coup. By the time in 1961 that President Kennedy was being elected, and John Kennedy defeated the then sitting Vice President Richard Nixon in the election of 1960. By the time Kennedy came into office, things were at an uneasy impasse. And Kennedy himself, he dragged his feet on the issues of desegregation. Kennedy had come into the office with this very audacious legislative program, and he relied very heavily on what was termed the Solid South, and that is the vast majority of the European American voters who were segregationists, or who at least supported segregationist candidates. And an abandonment of segregation would cause him his political platform, his political plan. It would have dire ramifications on his prospects of re-election. And very early on, Kennedy was already eyeing a re-election campaign in 1964. So while it was said that he was dismayed by the violence, he was ultimately unwilling to act. In an interesting twist, the civil rights leaders had a much higher opinion of Richard Nixon than John Kennedy. Nixon, we had discussed, was the enforcer in the Eisenhower White House, and while serving as vice president, he had built a stellar record on civil rights. He was a hardliner. He was known as a no-nonsense, no-fuss man. Politician when it came to communism, and also someone who had a very stellar civil rights record. Now, during the Easter of 1963, one of the more memorable, if not heartbreaking, events of the civil rights campaign took place. Birmingham was effectively overseen by her commissioner of public safety, Bull Connor. Connor had been described as a madman, someone with an irrational racial rage. He was a die-hard segregationist. And when the civil rights campaigners launched a new campaign to integrate Birmingham, they were confident that Connor would overreact and put the segregationists in the worst possible light. Now, during this campaign, Connor used attack dogs and water cannons to attack the demonstrators during the Birmingham campaign, and its response, his actions received major nationwide response. Connor had King arrested, and while in prison, King wrote the famous letter from Birmingham jail, which galvanized opinions against segregation. On the heels of the Birmingham campaign, segregationists began attacking churches, as they were the bedrock of the community and the sort of town hall for the civil rights organization's activism. Now, we'll break here, and we'll come back with part 2 of our lecture covering our analysis of the civil rights movement. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture.